Thank you for braving the heat and coming into a nice air-conditioned space for the next hour and a half. I really appreciate you being with us this morning for what is sure to be a timely discussion exploring the possibilities and the realities of a potential invasion of Taiwan. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm Senior Vice President of Research Programs here at the Stimson Center. And the project that our experts are going to unpack today speaks directly to one of the largest issues driving Washington's national security policy. For the better part of a decade, China has served as the pacing threat for American defense planners. The United States defense establishment has often turned to China as the focus of its future war planning. Within that framework, the prospect of an armed invasion of Taiwan is the most commonly cited scenario for defense planners here in Washington. The heavying up of defense to successfully meet a conflict over Taiwan in the Western Pacific has paved the way to build out numerous weapons programs, from aircraft carriers to AI-enabled drones, in a growing defense budget. But for all the mentions, the realities of what such an invasion would actually look like is often missing from the dialogue. Today's conversation is going to provide a clear-eyed assessment as our experts unpack these strategic issues and untangle the rhetoric from the reality on the ground. The three scholars that you will hear from today are an excellent example of what the Stimson Center does best: bringing talented and multifaceted scholars together in a way that maximizes their individual talents and areas of expertise. Dan Grazer is a Marine Corps veteran. He was a tank officer, which means he brings knowledge of what ground combat in a Taiwan scenario would entail. He's also a graduate of the Expeditionary Warfare School, which is the world's premier course for amphibious operations. James Siebens is the author and editor of China's Use of Armed Coercion to Win Without Fighting. He brings to this project an understanding of the strategic considerations of the region, as well as China's traditional predilection for achieving its strategic goals through means other than war. And McKenna Rollins has spent years studying Chinese military innovation and economic policies through her academic study of Chinese economics and political affairs. In short, you're in good hands for today's conversation, so I'm going to get out of your way so we can focus on the real experts here and let them do what they do best. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping notes. This event is being live streamed and recorded. It will be available to rewatch in its full event at stimson.org/events. We'll have time after we hear from our experts for questions, so I hope you'll participate. Our online audience can also participate. They can submit their questions at any point during this conversation by going to stimson.org/questions, while the audience here in DC can look out for the roaming microphone, which we'll make available during Q&A. So thank you again for joining us today, and now let me turn it over to Dan, James, and McKenna. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Any attempt by Communist China to conquer Taiwan by force would result in devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be. Facing these threats, we know that many countries are tempted by the idea of seeking both economic cooperation with China and defense cooperation with the United States. Now, that is a geographic necessity for many. But beware the leverage that the CCP seeks with that entanglement. China seeks to become a hegemonic power in Asia, no doubt. It hopes to dominate and control too many parts of this vibrant and vital region. China's behavior toward its neighbors and the world is a wake-up call, and an urgent one.
Well, that was the Secretary of Defense engaging in classic threat inflation when delivering remarks in Singapore on May 30th, 2025. So that was less than a month ago. I did not edit that video in any way. That was exactly how the Associated Press released it. And we'll note that he started off immediately talking about the prospect of an armed invasion of Taiwan. Because like Rachel said, China has been the pacing threat for the United States for the better part of a decade now, really since the end of the war on terror. And in reality, it goes back a little bit farther than that because the specter of a conflict over Taiwan was mentioned in the 2008 National Defense Strategy. So this isn't a political issue in Washington. This is an enduring talking point that's existed for quite some time, spanning multiple administrations. That's not to say that there aren't some realities to this, because there are actually some, the PRC has some ambitions towards Taiwan, but McKenna is going to better explain those than I will.
Thanks, Dan. So, since the end of the Chinese Civil War, when the remnants of the Republic of China, the ROC's forces, fled to Taiwan and other islands, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, has been consistently clear that there is but one China, that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and that the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. And this is known as the One China principle. And as you can see on this map that we've pulled from the PRC's Ministry of Natural Resources, they list Taiwan as a province. It's Taiwan Sheng right there. So there's no question or doubt as to the PRC's commitment to reunification. The key question that we raise is how the PRC intends to do so. And we question the premise that that is going to be in a large-scale amphibious invasion anytime soon. Thank you.
So as McKenna just laid out, the PRC's intentions to unify with the ROC, or Taiwan, are very clear. But it's also worth understanding that since the founding of the PRC, it has had a military doctrine centered on the idea of active defense, which is essentially waiting for the adversary to attack and then responding, counterattacking. And so this means that China's main strategic orientation is actually defensive, and that its emphasis is on deterrence. So it has attempted to position itself to be able to fight and win against an adversary with superior military forces by leveraging demonstrative force and also deterrence to dissuade potential intervention in what it regards as its internal affairs and to dissuade others from attacking it, essentially. Now, because it's focused on deterrence, is laid out in the science of military strategy so clearly, I want to offer you the definition of weishe, because I think of it actually as more akin to the concept of coercion, which includes deterrence and compellence, an effort to change the behavior of another actor. So they write that weishe, quote, targets the psychological, cognitive, and decision-making systems of the opponent. And its effect is to make the adversary aware on the balance of probabilities that taking a certain action will cost them more than they can afford and gain. Next slide, please. So one of the main reasons why I think we can expect the PRC to continue to consider unification by conquest to be its least favorable option is based on this emphasis on deterrence and also based on elements of China's strategic culture and military doctrine. I think you are probably familiar with the famous quote by Sun Tzu from his Art of War that says that to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Now, I think it's worth going a little bit further in that same section. Okay? He writes, the highest form of generalship is to balk the enemy's plans. The next best is to prevent the junction of the enemy's forces. The next in order is to attack the enemy's army in the field. And the worst policy of all is to besiege walled cities. In other words, to lay siege to a defensible, hardened position, like Taiwan, at the macro level. Okay? So it has been the PRC's stated aim for decades now to pursue unification through peaceful means if possible. Now, of course, peaceful means includes things that we would rightly regard as coercive, okay? And the PRC has many such options below the level of overt armed conflict. It can use cyber attacks to interfere in Taiwan's politics and exacerbate polarization in Taiwan's society and encourage disorder. And it has demonstrated the credibility of that option as more than just a kind of idle threat. It can also exert significant economic pressure on Taiwan by imposing bans or restrictions domestically on cross-strait investment and commerce. It could increase China's Coast Guard's interference in Taiwan's coastal waters, and it can unleash irregular forces to more aggressively harass Taiwanese commercial and fishing vessels, and to erode Taiwan's law enforcement authority in its surrounding waters. It can also launch punitive operations. If Taiwan is to take actions that the PRC disapproves of, it could seize one or more of Taiwan's outlying territories, which Taiwan would find practically indefensible in that event, and beyond recovery once those territories were lost. Now, the fact that the PRC hasn't already done something like this is actually good evidence of its commitment to pursuing options short of the use of force, if possible, because there are islands under control of the ROC that are quite close to China's mainland and quite vulnerable to coercion. And so if we see the PRC decide to ramp up pressure, we will certainly see it come earlier in those locales than a grand invasion and effort to conquer the main island of Taiwan. In the extreme, the PRC is preparing and making credible the threat of imposing a naval blockade on Taiwan. Okay? And that would not only impose economic hardship, that would apply coercive political pressure, but it could significantly undermine public confidence in Taiwan's government, and it would challenge the ROC to essentially fire the first shot in a war that would likely play to the PRC's advantage in an effort to break that quarantine or naval blockade, however you'd like to think of it. Next slide, please. So these kinds of operations are consistent with what China's science of military strategy refers to as primary methods of coercion, and it seems clear that all of these options are more likely than a full-scale invasion. In fact, these are things that we can see the PRC already doing, many of them, or that they're actively preparing to do. So these are not really hypothetical scenarios. Now, it's also important to recognize that some of these options would likely be prerequisite in the event that the PRC decides to launch the full-scale invasion and conquest of Taiwan, right? So they would engage in more limited operations to prepare the battlefield as they see it, and also to soften Taiwan's defenses in a prelude to full-scale invasion. So that means that the fact that China might pursue these options does not necessarily disprove their intention to launch a full-scale invasion, but it does mean that we can expect plenty of warning and plenty of leading indicators as China decides to dial up coercive pressure. And lastly, I'll say that there are numerous other reasons to doubt that China would choose to pursue the course of conquest, including its own social, political, and economic interests. And then lastly, the practical challenges that an invasion of Taiwan would inevitably represent. But for more on these factors, I'll turn back to Dan and McKenna.
So as the three of us studied this issue, we identified four main arguments against an armed invasion of Taiwan. So these are very practical, very basic considerations. You do not need to be a lifetime subscriber of Foreign Affairs magazine to understand these. And we're going to go over them in descending order of importance. So the first and strongest argument against is the risk of nuclear escalation. So if the CCP's leaders ordered an invasion, the chances are better than even that the United States would directly intervene. The American people can expect to pay more than $1 trillion next year on defense, with the Taiwan scenario as the principal justification for such a massive investment. It's difficult to imagine the United States sitting idle were the PLA to land troops outside of Kaohsiung after so much talk and after spending so much money for this exact scenario. But the danger is that were two nuclear superpowers, and remember, both the United States and China have nuclear weapons, were they to come to a direct military confrontation, there is the inherent risk that the conflict will escalate to the nuclear level. The U.S. military wargames these scenarios and has found that there is a significant temptation for leaders on the losing side of a conventional fight to resort to the use of nuclear weapons. An Army general who participated in one such exercise in 2017 said of this scenario, it gets into a very difficult calculus. It's clearly a place we do not want to go.
The second argument is the political one, which calls into question what the realities of a full-scale invasion of Taiwan would look like. And this includes, but is not limited to, the demographic constraints that would actually lead into the economic constraints as well. Because of 3.5 decades of family planning policies, namely the one-child policy in China, it has left the age bracket right at the fighting age, 1835, extremely fragile. And so what this means is China is facing an aging population crisis where there is not enough youths to replace the elderly physically, nor are there enough to support them economically in social welfare. And so in this red box, I've outlined the fighting age, and as you can see, it overlaps with the one-child policy timeframe, which ran from 1979 to 2015. This means that these children and these people and likely their parents were all single children and represent 6 family bloodlines. Xiaoshun, which is the concept of respecting your family and one's elders, is a core tenet of Confucianism. And so jeopardizing the longevity of these family lines would require a tremendous amount of political support from the people and for the party to try and engender. And however, a 2021 survey of Chinese public opinion conducted by the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego indicates that there is a lack of such support, actually. And they found that 2/3 of their respondents are actually opposed to a bellicose option and would prefer instead a pacifist approach or a mixed approach. And notably, their younger respondents tended to fall into the pacifist camp. So this would mean that the People's Liberation Army would be conscripting from not only an age bracket that can't sustain heavy losses, but also a group of people who may likely push against the very idea of risking their lives for an invasion, all adding to the political risks of an invasion generally. Next slide, please. So the next argument is, of course, the economics one, because there are serious constraints that the PRC would have to contend with before, during, and after launching an invasion of Taiwan. As I mentioned, any loss of life in that fragile bracket would worsen the long-term effects that the economy is already facing from the family planning policies, and it would only exacerbate that. The Chinese economy has been recently stunted by a series of unfortunate events, the trade war, the pandemic, and a housing market crisis. And so in the map on the right, you can see in orange is national GDP, and it plateaus in 2020. Juxtaposed against that is GDP per capita, which is in dark blue. And you may notice that the y-axis for national GDP is in trillions, whereas for per capita, it's only in the thousands. And it's much more volatile and is actually at a relatively low place for recent decades. On the left is a chart mapping PRC military spending over time as well as unemployment. And so what these graphs show you is a steady increase in military spending, yet tremendous amount of volatility for unemployment and economic well-being. So this would just add, again, to making the party have to justify diverting spending away from fixing their economic issues towards a military operation instead. Next slide, please. Research led by Martin White at Harvard University in 2023 found that Chinese families' feelings towards the future of their wealth have actually grown pessimistically over time. And so you can see from this chart that each income group has grown substantially pessimistic since 2014. Additionally, Freedom House's China Dissent Monitor has reported a 27% increase in dissent events from 2023 to 24, with the majority of these protests being led by workers, property owners, and then rural residents. Public support for the party is associated with personal economic well-being and the government's support for traditional Chinese values, namely Confucian traditions. Yet there is evidence of growing economic uncertainty for the people, which may call into question any support they would give to diverting their attention away from fixing economic issues and towards an invasion. Next slide, please. So to delve into the economics a little bit more, aside from all the political backlash that the party may face from diverting those resources, there will most certainly be economic consequences felt by the country writ large for any armed invasion of Taiwan. This is without even assuming if the United States intervenes, or any other country for that matter, because attack on Taiwan would impact international shipping, particularly the international shipping that occurs in close proximity to Taiwan. So here I have highlighted the top export destinations for the PRC in Asia, and as you can see, they are all near Taiwan. And annually, the PRC exports $971.2 billion worth of goods to these destinations alone. So any armed conflict will put that number at risk and impact trade flows. And for comparison, in 2021, when the Ever Given cargo ship blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days only, the PRC lost $73 billion. So you can imagine something of that weight or magnified being replicated by trade flows being affected from an armed invasion of Taiwan. And this is likely to get pushback from China's export-dependent industries because it is an export-dependent economy. Next slide, please. And we can look at trade between Taiwan and China specifically and see there is significant risk for any armed invasion. Because as you can see, the number one good traded back and forth is integrated circuits. So you might imagine that any armed invasion that would impact the flow of integrated circuits across the strait would have a negative impact on China's tech sector, which is something that the party has spent a lot of resources in several years and would definitely find pushback from that. And so these are just some of the economic and political constraints the PRC would have to contend with, regardless of an international response. So regardless of sanctions or boycotts, which would definitely exacerbate any of these negative consequences on the economy, and regardless if the US intervenes or not. So all of this would just add to the risk and cost of actually launching an invasion.
Right. So the strategic argument, the political argument, and the economic arguments are all three really, really strong arguments against China invading Taiwan. But the fourth argument is the practical military argument against. I argue that this is the weakest of all four of the arguments, but as you're going to see, and as we go through and like step by step, I think you're going to see that it's still a really strong argument against an invasion. And because the Taiwan scenario is the pacing threat that drives so much decision making, I think it's very important for everyone to fully think this scenario out in a step-by-step manner, so we understand and we're crafting the right strategies. So I'm going to start with a little audience participation here. How many people in this room have actually visited Taiwan? All right, it's a fair representation. It kind of expected that. Now, in most situations when Taiwan is discussed in the news, it's usually depicted like this. This is a map that CNN used for a story that they ran about Taiwan just a couple months ago. And all it is, it's a flat political map. And it shows Taiwan's proximity to the mainland of China without a whole lot of detail. And what this map does is it creates the impression that the challenge of an invasion is just crossing that little strait or that little strip of water in between the mainland and the main island, and then the PLA soldiers only have to wade ashore to conquer the island. But if you take a look at another kind of map, you start to get a little different idea of the situation. Because you find out that just with this switch of a map, you look and you find out that Taiwan is a much more complex environment than a simple flat political map gives you the impression of. You can see right there, Taiwan is incredibly mountainous. We're going to go over that in a little bit more detail because that does play, that shapes everything in Taiwan. It absolutely creates sets the character for the entire place.
So to get a better feeling for the terrain, Dan and I actually visited Taiwan back in April, and over the course of 10 days, we saw as much as we possibly could. We went from Taipei up to Shillong, over to Luodong, back across to Taichung, up the mountains to Alishan, further down to Tainan, and all the way down to Kaohsiung before shooting back up to Taipei, only over the course of 10 days. So we covered quite a bit of ground, and we traveled primarily by rail and by bus so that we could actually see what the area in the cities looked like, but more importantly, what the area in between the cities looks like and what it looks like, what separates cities, basically, which is really important when you're thinking of how to potentially make one's way to Taipei City.
Right. And so I can assure you, as someone who was at one point a qualified amphibious planner, amphibious landing anywhere is not a trivial matter. So even a lightly opposed battalion-sized landing of less than 1,000 troops requires intricate coordination between ground, naval, and air forces. These forces have to be sequenced properly, vessels have to be combat loaded, and timetables need to be laid out to the minute and even sometimes by the second in many cases. The scale of an opposed landing is almost beyond comprehension. So this is a picture from right after the D-Day landings in northern France in June of 1944. The D-Day landings involved more than 150,000 soldiers and nearly 200,000 naval personnel. It required approximately 7,000 naval vessels and 13,000 aircraft. And all of these assets needed to be coordinated properly for the operation to have any hope of success. And even with all of these assets and months of planning by people who had real, practical, fresh experience in earlier amphibious operations in World War II, Dwight Eisenhower still felt it necessary to draft a statement in the event the landing failed. A PLA invasion of Taiwan in the 21st century would be the most complex single military operation in history. It would be orders of magnitude more complicated than anything that was carried off in the 20th century. To conquer territory, you still need significant ground forces. So today that includes tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, logistics, and a huge number of soldiers. And then add to that now unmanned aerial vehicles, long-range missiles, cyber capabilities, and uncrewed naval vessels. So just simply crossing the Taiwan Strait would be a challenge. The PLA would have a difficult time hiding preparations for an invasion. So like all the preparations, so the movement of forces towards the embarkation points on the mainland, that would be visible. The gathering of naval vessels, to load up, that would also be visible. So that would give the defenders on Taiwan a chance to have some time to prepare. And it would also give Taiwan's allies an opportunity to move forces in place to challenge a crossing. Naval operations themselves have also changed dramatically just in recent years. The Ukrainians have effectively established control over the Black Sea, and they did so without a naval fleet. They used a combination of shore-based missiles and uncrewed vessels to inflict severe losses on the Russian Navy, and therefore the Russian Navy has had to keep away from the Ukrainian coast. The Taiwanese could do the same to the Chinese in the Taiwan Strait. Now, if the PLAN, if the People's Liberation Army Navy, managed to cross the strait, the soldiers would still have to contend with Taiwan's challenging terrain. Even though Taiwan is an island, it actually has very few militarily useful beaches. The majority of the Taiwanese coastline consists of cliffs that drop straight down out of the mountains directly into the sea. So those beaches that do exist all present a problem for an amphibious force, because none of the beaches have the kind of ground behind them a force would need to effectively stage forces for follow-on operations. Because generally the sequencing goes, when you plan for an amphibious operation, you have to make it to the landing beaches, then you have to establish a beachhead, and then you have to defend that beachhead while you transition more combat power ashore, so you generate that combat power for the subsequent breakout operations. And that's a big problem in Taiwan because, like in this case, many of Taiwan's beaches have miles of farmland directly behind them. And farmland in a subtropical Asian country includes lots of rice paddies. So this is imagery taken from Google Earth that shows the ground behind one of the more useful landing beaches in the southern part of Taiwan. And you can see here that there are miles of rice paddies and fish farms an invader would have to cross before reaching a useful road. So the challenge isn't simply limited to crossing that farmland. The invading force would need to stage soldiers and supplies to generate combat power ashore before executing that subsequent breakout. And a fish farm is not a good place to stack boxes of ammunition. It's also not a good place to quarter a bunch of troops as they're preparing to carry on the fight. So the other option that avoids slogging through water-intensive agricultural land is equally unappealing, but for a very different reason. So several of Taiwan's cities sit close to shore and therefore present an invader with a prospect of landing and then immediately engaging in urban combat as the rest of the force attempts to land behind them. So this is imagery of Tainan, and I selected this purposefully because Tainan has traditionally been the entry point into, well, first Formosa and now Taiwan. And we're going to talk more about the challenges associated with Taiwan's farmland and cities in a little bit. But I wanted to cover the crossing and the two very practical considerations of landing right off the top, because this is typically where the conversation about the Taiwan scenario ends in Washington. It's presumably that's because American involvement in this conflict is usually framed in just air and naval terms. But the People's Liberation Army planners have to think about what happens after the landing, because it doesn't make any sense just to capture a beach. They actually have to conquer the country. And that's where the real challenges of this scenario are actually found.
So to get a better idea of what Taiwan's land usage breakup actually is, here are two maps, one showing population density and one showing land usage by type. So as you can see on the map on the left, Taiwan's cities are not only large, but they're very dense. And for reference, in 2020, Taipei's population density was 9,500 people per square kilometer. New York City's was 11,000. So it's almost about the same size as New York City. And so you can imagine New York-sized cities lining the western coast of Taiwan. But on the right side, you'll see land usage showing rice paddies and crops in the same areas because agriculture is sprinkled in between cities and even in between high-rises. And so they've really utilized every inch of arable land that they possibly can.
Right. So a simple fact about Taiwan that many people who have never been there and don't know is that Taiwan is an incredibly mountainous island. So the Central Mountain Range covers about 60% of the land surface. It's a very beautiful region, but it is not well suited for significant development or for any large-scale military operations. Taiwan's mountains are also very impressive. They are the tallest in East Asia. Yushan, or Jade Mountain, is nearly 13,000 feet tall. It's actually just out of the frame here. This was a shot watching the sunrise over the Central Mountain Range. But the mountains just go on and on and on. They really do give the island its character, and they also literally shape the patterns of life and how land is used. So I snapped this picture from my hotel room in Ludong on the East Coast. And it's illustrative of how Taiwan's mountains are almost always in frame, just looming in the background. McKenna took this shot from a spot overlooking the northern city of Shillong. And you can really see here how every available square inch of flat ground is used for development because they have to cram in a population of nearly 24 million people into the available ground, for building. And so you end up with a lot of scenes like this, where cities are just kind of wedged in to wherever they fit in the landscape. So I like this picture because it's very illustrative of showing Taiwan's complex terrain outside of the cities and how transitions tend to be quite abrupt. Now, putting on my tanker goggles once again, this kind of terrain actually terrifies me as an attacker because I look at this and I can see really only a couple places where I can go. So I'd be able to go on the roads, like through around the farmland in the center of the frame. I'd be able to go through the little village on the roads. But everything else is no-go territory for me. I'm not going to take a tank up over those mountains that are covered in a blanket of dense jungle, and I'm certainly not going to take tanks through the rice paddies. So for an attacker, this is a very dangerous environment. For a defender, this is about the best ground you can possibly imagine, because you have defenders all up in the mountains just raining shots down on the exposed tankers who have no place to hide in that scene.
We talk a lot about Taiwan's agriculture and specifically rice paddies, because along our journey, we could see the rice paddies for miles and miles and miles, or again, in random places that you wouldn't expect, like in between buildings. And they're very distinct because at that time in April, they were bright green, and they would have rows of the water reflecting the sky above, just signaling them to you from miles away. And for reference, in 2024, Taiwan planted 250,000 hectares of rice alone. And this is important to know because a rice paddy is surrounded by a retaining wall of about 3 to 4 feet, but inside that is roughly 20 to 30 centimeters deep of water, but then more importantly, mud.
So the British learned a very hard lesson in Korea during the Korean War, that tanks and rice paddies do not mix very well. So this is a picture from 1950. It shows a British Centurion tank in the distance there that got stuck in rice paddies, and this is a recovery vehicle in the front that's trying to winch it out. And you'll notice that the soldiers, the crewmen, are out of their vehicle because you have to get out of the vehicle to rig a tank to tow. And I can personally attest to the difficulty of recovering such a tank. So 18 years ago, I'll tell you a little, it's not exactly a war story, this is a training story. But 18 years ago, one of the other platoons in my tank company down in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, got a vehicle stuck in the mud. It took 2 days, and both of the company's recovery vehicles to pull that vehicle out of the mud in a very unpleasant little impromptu training exercise. So let's imagine for a second that the Taiwanese managed to overcome the challenge of crossing the strait, and then overcame the challenge of finding an appropriate landing beach, establishing a beachhead, and generating combat power ashore, and then just fighting, and then conducting the break, and then attempting to conduct the breakout from the beachhead. They then have to overcome the challenge of conducting movements overland. So I think we've firmly established that tanks cannot drive in rice paddies. One of the very first lessons I learned when I was going through armor school in Fort Knox a very long time ago now was tanks don't go where cattails grow. Tanks and marshy terrain just do not mix. So an armored unit that was trying to cross this terrain would have to be stuck to the surface roads. And notice the rectangle, the red rectangle in the top part of this picture. Pay attention to that, because on the left-hand side you see kind of two long, narrow buildings roughly going up and down. That's a poultry farm. Now here's the street view image taken from within that red rectangle. This is what the surface roads through the rice paddies look like. Now for a tanker, like I look at this and I see that I'm going to have to line up my entire unit, one tank right behind the other, which is not my favorite way to move, especially when there's potential enemy action. I want tanks spread out as much as possible to be able to concentrate firepower. When we're all lined up, we have to minimize firepower because you can't shoot tanks, you can't shoot over the tank in front of you, basically. So armored vehicles would have to line up in a row straight down the middle of this narrow road. You can't go off the side because you look, there's the drainage ditches on either side, which is just about the exact right size to swallow up tank treads. So if you get a driver gets off to the side, that tank's going to drop down. It's going to high center, and it's going to get stuck there. And it would take a wind. You'd have to lift with a crane. You have to lift that vehicle up to get it recovered from there. if the driver turned really sharply, he'd be able to go over that, but then he'd just be stuck in the mud. So it creates a real problem for movements across the landscape in Taiwan, because if there was some kind of an obstacle that was set up in this road, the commander of the advancing force would have really limited options, about the only option they could have. Maybe they might be able to push a vehicle off the road, but they'd probably also push the other vehicle would probably go over into the rice paddies, pushing the obstacle. Or they could pivot steer and they could go in a different direction and try to find a way around. Well, when you do that, anytime you turn like that, you're just creating opportunities for a defender to shoot the vulnerable parts of the armor in your vehicles. So this is a deeply unappealing prospect for me. And if you want a historic precedent, go look at Operation Market Garden in late 1944 in World War II. So that was if you ever saw the movie A Bridge Too Far, this is depicted in that movie. Because the British landed a bunch of airborne forces to capture bridges, and then the British 30 Corps was supposed to go up this single country road, single lane country road that was just surrounded on either side by canals and marshland. And the reason why that mission failed was because the British 30 Corps just could not make it up fast enough to relieve the airborne forces. It's a perfect historic parallel to everything that an invader of Taiwan would have to deal with. So if they wanted to avoid that, Taiwan being a developed island, it has plenty of highways, and they're robust highways, but they're also elevated in many spots. So that creates another big problem for any offender or for any invader, because if they got on the elevated roads and they tried making a beeline up to Taipei, it's a very easily defended terrain, because all you have to do is drop a couple bridge sections to completely halt forward movement, because there's no way to bypass in that case. Because if they try getting off the road, they get stuck in the rice paddies, they get stuck on the surface roads, and they have all the same problems that they had before. And just to illustrate the point, this is not the greatest picture ever, but I snapped this from the backseat of a taxi, traveling down one of these highways, and just to show sort of the constricted terrain and how prevalent these roads are. So we're traveling in one direction on this highway, while the traffic going in the opposite direction is up above us, because they literally had to stack the highways through this narrow canyon. All right, so another challenge that's thrown up by the island itself is the restricted terrain. Like I said, Taiwan's covered in mountains. Well, these mountains, they jog out towards the coastline in many cases. So if an invader landed in the south part of the country, which is the more likely scenario, to happen, because it'd be next to impossible to land directly in Taipei. So they land south of the city, and then they overcome all the obstacles to try to fight their way north. They have to contend with all the choke points, the natural choke points that are created by the mountains as they jog towards the coast. And in one case, a significant portion of Taiwan's armor units are actually permanently stationed directly at one of these choke points, to take advantage of the natural defensive terrain. And so any potential attacker, would have to overcome a lot of those obstacles and blast their way through these choke points. But even if they do blast through those choke points, then they're still stuck with Taiwan's very broken and difficult terrain on the other side. And also, speaking of restricted terrain, Taiwan's east coast, the Yilan Plain, kind of towards the northern part of the east coast of the island, offers up some really beautiful beaches. So that's me standing on one of those beaches about midway, in the plain there, and the beaches were quite lovely. And I thought, hey, you know what? This might be a viable option. And they might be, an invader could potentially use those beaches to establish a beachhead, But then behind that, there's still the problem of there's two major cities, Ludong and Yilan, in the plain, and then there's a lot of farmland in between. So even if all of that was overcome, any invader would be stuck in that plain because that plain is completely surrounded by mountains. The most direct route to Taipei, which is off the screen towards the northwest from there, is Highway 5. And that rectangle, McKenna and I took the bus from Taipei over to Ludong. So we traveled that road. And that rectangle, that last part of the highway leading into the Yilan Plain, that's a tunnel. It's a 10-kilometer long tunnel that any potential invader would have to travel through just to try to approach Taipei. And the rest of that highway isn't any better because as soon as you get out of that tunnel, and here's a picture of the entrance to that tunnel from the west heading east. You get through that tunnel, and then there's this really long bridge right behind it that you had to cross. And where there isn't a bridge crossing a narrow, deep river valley, the highway is just like carved into a shelf on the side of mountains. And it's like that for the entire route in between the cities. Oop. All right, so you overcome all of those obstacles, and now an invader starts trying to approach Taipei. So Taipei it's surrounded by mountains. It's built on an ancient lake bed, and essentially all the water's been drained out, and it's been replaced by a lot of dense urban development. So an invader that even gets close would have to fight through all the narrow mountain passes, that serve as the approaches to the city. And like everywhere else in Taiwan, each available inch of flat ground is put to use. So one of the river valleys that provides one of the better approaches into the city, one of the wider approaches to the city, I should say, it's highly developed with what is effectively one long, narrow city with a meandering river snaking through the center of it. So an attacker would have to overcome all the natural and man-made obstacles through that valley, blocking forward movement, while simultaneously contending with defenders firing on them from the mountains that overlook both sides. All right, so even if an invader overcame all those obstacles, they crossed the strait, they established the beachhead, they generated combat power ashore, they figured out a way to conduct a breakout, they figured out how to overcome all the natural obstacles created by the cities and rice paddies to fight their way north. They blasted through the choke points, and then they braved the approaches to Taipei. Their reward is then fighting in Taipei. And this is what the city looks like from the observation deck of Taipei 101. So Taipei, the Taipei proper is actually relatively small with approximately 2.6 million people, but the entire metro area that includes New Taipei and Shillong and sometimes Taoyuan is thrown in there. But the larger, Greater Taipei has over 7 million people with a population density of over 9,000 people per square kilometer. So the city is incredibly dense at street level. And it rises, pretty tall. I mean, we're standing on we're on the 91st floor of one of the tallest buildings in the world, so we're overlooking a lot. But at street level, Taipei just jumps out of the ground up in the sky. And so the People's Liberation Army planners would have to prepare to fight through Taipei. These would have to be contingency plans. And just to give you an idea of the scale of urban combat, let's talk about the Second Battle of Fallujah in late 2004. So the city of Fallujah is approximately 25 square kilometers, and it's surrounded by flat, open desert. Few buildings in that city rise above 2 stories. American military planners isolated the city prior to the battle and ordered all the civilians to evacuate before the assault. The actual battle was fought by the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, which was heavily reinforced with units from the U.S. Army, the British Army, and reconstituted Iraqi Army forces. It took a month and a half for nearly 15,000 coalition troops to clear that city, which was defended by approximately 4,000 insurgents. Greater Taipei is nearly 100 times the size of Fallujah, just in terms of square kilometers. And a significant portion of the buildings in Taipei rise more than 20 stories. It would take a huge force to capture Taipei. The ratio that American military planners use when planning for a deliberate assault against a planned defense is 3 attackers for every 1 defender. If the entire ROC army of 1.6 million were to contest the invasion, the PLA would have to send nearly 5 million soldiers, which is about 10 times its current size. And here's another very important practical consideration. Taiwan is in an earthquake zone. So the country has very strict building standards, especially after the 1999 Chi earthquake. Last year, on April 3rd, 2024, a 7.4 magnitude earthquake struck the eastern city of Huilin. The quake caused 22 buildings to collapse all around the island of Taiwan. The story here in the United States disappeared within 2 days because Taiwan's infrastructure handled the quake effectively and damage was slight considering the strength of the event. For comparison's sake, for those of you old enough to remember this, the 1994 Northridge quake in California was a magnitude 6.7 and caused massive damage, including collapsing large freeway segments. And I bring up this point only because cities robust enough to essentially shrug off a 7.4 magnitude quake will also take that much more combat power to subdue.
So in laying out all of these kind of inherent operational challenges that an invading force would face, I think the important thing to take away is not only that those challenges are, if not insurmountable, highly difficult challenges for military planners and would present daunting prospects for any of the PLA planners or China's decision makers when confronting the prospect of conquering the main island of Taiwan. But also, China has many more operational options aside from that conquest scenario that it is much better situated to pursue and in fact better practiced at implementing, including at the high end, that blockade scenario that I think is kind of also part of this invasion scenario as well, prerequisite to this invasion scenario. So there are 2 things that I would like to conclude with. One is to be clear about the fact that the PRC does intend to pursue unification. There shouldn't be confusion about that point. It is and has been pursuing unification, and it has stated its preference for pursuing unification through peaceful means if possible. That means that its emphasis is on shaping the behavior of the government in Taipei and shaping the behavior of the government in Washington, D.C. through deterrence. It is clearly attempting to deter Taiwan from taking formal steps at secession, to permanently separate from China as a matter of principle. And it is also attempting to deter the United States from encouraging independence or affecting the permanent separation of Taiwan from the mainland. That's the first point, because it means that the decision to attack Taiwan, to escalate against Taiwan, will not only be based on a calculation made in Beijing, but also by calculations made in Taipei and Washington, D.C. There are steps that can be taken by Taipei and Washington that could cause escalation, that China is not pursuing escalation in an acontextual manner. It is pursuing escalation for purposes of shaping those decision calculus. Lastly, China is pursuing unification through political warfare and through coercion and coercive diplomacy. So if the United States wants to support Taiwan, it must first grapple with how to support Taiwan against the things that China is actually doing in real time, not a fairly far afield prospect of a large-scale invasion. As I said earlier, there would be plenty of warning if China decided to embark upon that campaign, and that campaign would first require a softening of Taiwan's defenses. We would see seizure of outlying territories. We would see escalation of coercive measures first, well in advance. So, rather than fixating on this option that China is least inclined to pursue and least capable of executing, and that is least likely to succeed, I think that we should place more emphasis on the variety of other options that we've laid out below the threshold of war.
And so we just want to leave you all with 3 takeaways before Dan takes it home with the conclusion. First, don't prepare for the wrong war. Second, remember the political and economic constraints. And third, question the premise. Always question the premise.
Right. Just to drive that last point home too, I get it. What we're saying here today very much goes against the accepted narrative here in Washington. But just because a lot of people say the same thing doesn't mean that that thing is right. And so, the prospect of China invading Taiwan has really devolved into nothing more than a talking point here in Washington that nobody questions. It's just thrown out there. That's the premise, and then everybody just kind of argues the details, within that. And again, nobody really seems to take any time to think about what would this actually look like. Particularly, what would this look like from the perspective of a People's Liberation Army planner? But the Taiwan scenario does serve a useful purpose here in Washington. It justifies virtually every conceivable weapon system. A fight over Taiwan would require a huge naval fleet, stealth aircraft, autonomous weapons, cyber capabilities, and long-range munitions. Like I said before, the American people will almost certainly pay more than $1 trillion next year on the Department of Defense's base budget, with defending Taiwan as the principal justification. But a reasonable question to ask is, why hasn't an invasion of Taiwan happened yet? The status quo has existed for 76 years now. What are the Chinese waiting for? It's not like their chances of success actually improve as time goes on. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The chances of success in this scenario are diminishing almost by the day as technology improves and proliferates. For all the reasons we laid out here today, I just don't believe the CCP's leaders are foolish enough to order an invasion because the risks far outweigh any potential rewards. Hyping up the purported threat to Taiwan to justify greater defense spending here is dangerous, though, and beyond the mere wasted resources, which is why I think it's important for people to understand the realities of the situation. There is the inherent risk of an arms race. The United States is undertaking both a conventional and nuclear arms modernization effort right now. China is likewise building up its own forces. And as both sides treat each other with suspicion, there is always the risk of a miscalculation. Again, I'm old enough to remember what the big international incident story was prior to the terrorist attacks on September 11th. It was the April 2001 Hainan Island incident when a U.S. Navy P-3 reconnaissance aircraft collided with a Chinese J-8 fighter over the South China Sea and was forced to land at a Chinese air base. That incident was resolved after 10 days when the United States issued a statement of regret for the death of the Chinese pilot and for entering China's airspace. The entire episode was a tense moment which could have easily escalated had leaders on either side handled matters differently. And if we keep ramping up tensions the way that we are right now, a similar episode could easily spark a conflict. Another equally dangerous phenomena will also result. While I believe a direct conflict with China is unlikely, there will always be another war, unfortunately, someplace. And when that inevitably happens, we will hear the ghost of Don Rumsfeld telling us, you go to war with the army you have, not the one you want. So we're going to spend $1 trillion a year buying F-47s and four-class aircraft carriers. The Marine Corps has already reshaped itself specifically to fight this one very specific scenario. When the United States inevitably goes and fights someplace else against a less sophisticated adversary, we will employ the weapons designed to fight this scenario in a very different kind of war. And just as happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States will lose in the moral dimension of conflict from the very beginning, because sending aircraft costing more than $100 million to drop GPS-guided bombs against tribal fighters isn't just overkill, it creates the ultimate Goliath versus David situation. The United States needs a responsible defense policy based on realistic strategy assessments. I understand the desire to cover all bases. There are plenty of people who believe that by preparing for the worst case scenario, the military will be ready to handle any situation. But that is simply not the case. What we end up with is a military force that is prepared for the wrong war and is too sophisticated to fight the kind of wars that actually do happen. So with that, we're happy to take your questions here in the audience and questions from our online audience as well. All right, there's a microphone that'll be coming around about right up front row.
Thank you. Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia of Japan. So I have a feeling, first a comment, fascinating presentation, thank you. But aren't we looking at the scenario through our eyes? Like, the operation will be difficult, therefore Beijing will calculate the risk-reward. But in a scenario where China does decide to invade, it will be when Taiwan declares independence, at which point it's not about reward or risk, they have to do it anyway. And my question is, if they do it and they actually manage to reach Taipei and occupy Taiwan, and now it comes to the American part, how the difficulties that the PLA faced in occupying Taiwan, that applies to the US going in and trying to reverse the situation. Is it possible, how difficult is it for the Americans to reverse the occupation just through conventional means? Does it have to escalate? Shouldn't we be talking about that aspect too?
I think that you've kind of premised that China has successfully occupied Taiwan. And that is the premise that I think we're challenging, that is not an easy prospect and not a prospect that we should expect, actually, because prior to that, if Taiwan were to formally declare independence or change its constitution to otherwise define itself as separate from China, China would respond somehow, some way, but its initial response would not be to suddenly successfully occupy the main island. It would be to fight a war in which Taiwan would have the advantages that accrue to defenders of very defensible territory. So I think the first stage of that conflict would be one in which China would be the clear aggressor and Taiwan would be able to use all of its geographic and topographical advantages to its benefit, and that the United States would clearly be able to contest the Taiwan Strait, or at least aid Taiwan in contesting the Taiwan Strait prior to any kind of successful occupation framework. Now, if we magically imagined the PLA in possession of Taiwan, I agree with you very much that those same challenges that we're talking about would face anyone trying to expel the PRC from possession of Taiwan. So certainly the advantage goes to the defender, goes to the incumbent in possession of Taiwan in that sense.
And if I may add, I think it's important to think of what that would look like for the PRC on Taiwan, where you'd have millions of people who just went through armed invasion and would likely, resist any sort of control over their cities and areas, which would, create further challenges. And as you're talking about what would happen if trying to change control of the cities after the PLA landed, I think that is something that the PLA and the PRC would not want to be set with. Once they acquired the island, they wouldn't want 24 million people trying to kick them out of it.
Richard.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Rich Cronin. I'm a fellow here at Stimson, and during COVID, I made a deep dive into semiconductors and the China-Taiwan semiconductor issue. And so I compliment this. The panel's been excellent, but it's the first time I've seen in a sort of war game kind of program mention of semiconductors, and the fact that the China depends on Taiwan for 60% of the chips that it uses. That's not even counting they can't get the cutting edge chips anymore. But well, not in mass anyway. But the thing is that the Chinese have the largest electronic assembly industry and the largest motor vehicle industry, and there's no way that they could even capture those foundries, because they don't bounce, and require all kinds of people to keep them running, and so that's why they talk about a silicon shield. But again, when I read about war games and all that, and I never get what you've gotten to. And just one other thing, in a bigger picture kind of way, the Chinese Navy is it's going to be a regional Navy. It's blue water's not quite yet, but regional, up to at least up into and beyond the so-called first island chain. But there are two choke points to get out of there: the Miyako Straits between the Japanese islands, and I forget the name of the strait in the south near Philippines. And so this is my question. Well, my observation is exactly what you're talking about, and that is, why are we, in large, the military, the foreign and security communities, policy communities, why are we taking this trip, and why have we been taking it for so long? And particularly because if there's a war with China, it's going to be over those straits, and it would be both armies would be going around MacArthur-like island, hopping, rather than trying to actually fight on Taiwan. So, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Now, your report on the Silicon Shield is, I think, an excellent read for anybody in the audience, and it is, I think, embedded in this analysis about the economic factors that would, in and of themselves, likely deter China from taking the decision willingly to break friendly, or at least break the peace.
Sir, third row.
Thank you. My name is Mark. I'm from United Daily News. We're based in Taiwan. So first, I'm grateful for this wonderful presentation, and I'm just glad that our notorious transportation infrastructure really creates some problems for the PLA. I'll be very glad when I'll be have more appreciation when I drive in Taiwan in the future. So a couple questions. First, the deterrence. The word of deterrence has been thrown around a lot, but it really has no definite meaning. I'm just wondering, how do we quantify that word? Does it mean that we have to hold off PLA for 1 month, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, or does it mean we have to eliminate their first wave of forces or second wave of forces? What does deterrence mean for Taiwan? And second question is, you have mentioned a lot about the landing, what happened when they land. Do you have a probable landing sites, maybe a top 3 landing sites for the PLA? Thank you.
So I'm going to answer your second question first. I've studied this problem for like 2 years, really, And I've tried to figure out, like, if I was a PLA planner, like, where would I go? I have some ideas about that, but I don't want to do the PLA planner's job for him. So I'm pretty careful, in most cases, not to identify specific locations that that we looked at. I think there are some more viable landing sites than others, but even still, the landing site is only just one part of the problem. There's all kinds of challenges that come, beyond that, and they're ubiquitous for no matter where an invader would land in Taiwan, they would have to deal with all the other challenges of restricted terrain and the approaches to Taipei and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there are some places, maybe offline I'll fill you in on that. Your first question though about deterrence, I think again, the entire premise of this project is that I don't believe the Chinese want to do this in the first place. And so I think deterrence in that context means just making sure that they continue to not want to do this to begin with. It's not about, all right, they make the decision and then we hold them, if we can delay them, by this long, then that gives allies a chance to come in here. I think that's kind of the wrong way to look at it. I think it's just about making sure that that everybody that's involved in this, the Taiwanese and like all their potential allies, just take reasonable, practical steps to make the idea of invading Taiwan deeply, deeply unappealing to Chinese strategic leaders.
That's well said, and I have to jump in because what does deterrence mean is my favorite question anybody could have asked. And it is exactly as Dan said, that it is preventing China from deciding to invade. The scenarios you described are defense, right? How well can Taiwan prevent China from reaching its shores? But deterrence is about the decision-making calculus of the PRC's leadership to ensure that they understand this prospect as undesirable and too risky, and therefore decide not to do it, to pursue other options. And I think we're living in an other options space, which is why my preference would be for us to focus our efforts on those other scenarios.
Just one last thing about what beachwood might it be. That's going to be changing over time and has been changing over time with ecological harm to the beaches. Taiwan's coasts are starting to erode as cities expand. What was once a beach is now a city, and so that calculus is constantly changing over time.
I think we're going to go to a question from the audience, or from our online audience, and this question comes from Peter Osilia. I apologize, Peter, if I've mispronounced your name, your last name there. But the question is China considering using missiles and drones against Taiwan instead of launching a ground invasion?
It's a perfect example of the kind of scenario that is available for China to launch punitive operations and use its armed forces to coerce Taiwan without launching this massive invasion scenario. I did not discuss the kind of special operations or other tactics like that. We have seen some of those kinds of tactics play out very recently, so I won't draw excessive attention to them here, but to say, absolutely, those are the kinds of options I would expect well in advance of an invasion and probably instead of or more likely than an invasion.
I'll add to that, though. I'm a military historian. I've been studying military history for decades now, and you can't conquer territory without a ground invasion. You just can't do it. There's been lots of very lengthy, costly experiments in air power alone, and they failed every single time. Wars are only won on the ground. Sorry, United States Air Force. Wars are only won on the ground. Air power can help with that as long as operations are coordinated properly, but just airstrikes by themselves do not win wars. Sir.
Hi, Christopher McPherson, Headquarters Marine Corps Strategy Branch. So I think you've done a very good job of laying out why a cross-strait invasion is fairly unlikely. But in that case, what would you recommend be the military or the whole of government approach to denying what you say is the most likely course of action, the coercive campaign, be that political warfare, cognitive warfare? What should we be doing instead of focusing on that narrow stretch of water?
Focusing on the narrow stretch of water is a good place to start. A porcupine strategy that makes Taiwan seem even more impregnable than it might already seem, that would be light on U.S. political and symbolic commitments that could risk pushing China's calculus into the zone that I think Ken was cautioning about, where they feel forced to demonstrate their seriousness about this issue. I think this is the principal challenge that we face, is striking a balance between improving deterrence and Taiwan's practical ability to defend itself in the unlikely scenario that it was invaded or attacked, versus respecting the policy that has kept us out of a war with China this whole time. And that is the one China policy. That is an agreement tacitly to not declare war on China by seeking to permanently deprive it of what it regards as its sovereign territory, while also not betraying the trust or undermining the interests of the people of Taiwan.
We'll take another question from our online audience, and this is actually a really good one. I'm glad this question came up. This is from Matt Breeze from the University of Minnesota. He asks, what impact did the planned U.S. invasion of Formosa in World War II, Operation Causeway, have on your analysis? Matt, thank you very much for this question, because I did study Operation Causeway in pretty thorough detail. The reason you all have never heard of Operation Causeway is because it didn't actually happen. So there was an idea. Some of the senior military personnel in the Pacific Theater in World War II believed that Formosa would be kind of an unsinkable aircraft carrier to be used as stage forces for the planned invasion of the home islands of Japan. And so the War Department conducted a big staff study for Operation Causeway, where they actually planned out what an invasion of Formosa would look like. And you can find the staff study online now. So at the time, in late 1944, when this was planned, Formosa was occupied by Japan, and the United States planned on a 9-division invasion of Formosa. And if I remember correctly, they planned on I don't know, it was well more than 4,000, like 4,500 or so naval vessels were going to be used to invade Formosa. Now the interesting part about this, like a division is about, in World War II is about 20,000 soldiers or so. So it was a big invasion force, and but at the time, the island of Formosa was occupied by less than 100,000 Japanese forces. And most of those were administrative staff. About a third of the Japanese personnel on Formosa in 1944 were actual soldiers. And so it wasn't a big occupation force that the Americans would have to overcome in order to conquer Formosa. But even with all of that, and again, that was an operation that was planned by people who had very recent practical experience conducting amphibious landings. It was also at the peak of American military power. The U.S. military was about 12 million people by that point in the war. Like if any military force was prepared to conduct an invasion of Formosa, it was the United States in 1944. But even still, all of those people looked at the situation and said, nope. Too much, we're not doing this, we're going someplace else. So if our military, at the peak of its combat power at that point, decided that Formosa was not a very good place to conduct an amphibious operation, I think the same pretty much holds true today when the challenges are that much more formidable. I think we'll take another one. How about John up front over here?
Thank you all so much. It's a great presentation. I'm going to kind of build on the last two questions a little bit. So James, you've totally convinced me we're not going to invade, or the Chinese are not going to invade Taiwan, but this coercion through a blockade. My biggest question is, what can the United States do to deter that? I mean, if I think about, you know, the last big blockade between great powers, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're kind of the Russians in this scenario, right? We have somewhat better naval basing than them, but they had basically two options: lose a large naval battle or use nuclear weapons. It seems like we're in a bit of the same place. I mean, if I think about the cratering effects report that your colleagues have done, you know, we basically have no air power in the region for 30 days. We're firing off years and years of production, or at least procurement, of THAADs, Patriots, and Standard missiles in the Middle East right now, which limits our ability to even protect our bases that are in the region. What can the United States do to prevent this course of blockade if it does happen?
So again, this is the very, very delicate political aspect of this question, is U.S. declaratory policy. Something that I would, it's less about capabilities than it is about intention, in a sense. And China is developing the capabilities to impose a blockade, but its intention to do so is contingent. And so that's where I would focus thinking. Something that the U.S. or other countries in the region that might have an interest in this premise could do is to emphasize how important their economic relationship with Taiwan is to them as a matter of national interest. So it doesn't place Taiwan's political status as the kind of cornerstone of the policy, but it can say that we regard it as a vital national interest to maintain trade relations with Taiwan, to maintain our access to the market and to their goods and services. Those are vital national interests. That would more clearly convey, perhaps, and more clearly steer away from these sensitive political questions towards something that I think the PRC would take very seriously, because it is the case that the United States is dependent on commerce with Taiwan in some respects, especially high technology, other countries also. So the PRC has to understand that an effort to impose a naval blockade on Taiwan would be an act of aggression, not just against Taiwan, but against all of its partners.
Sir, on the end right there.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an author and an editorial contributor to a number of policy publications, but two quick comments. First, a little historic footnote that may be amusing or informative. I'm probably one of the few people in the room who is old enough to, as a little boy, my parents permitted me to watch the Nixon-Kennedy debates in 1960. In one of them, the major topic of discussion was Kimoy and Matsu, and the major thrust of it was General Eisenhower's a pussy, he's not tough enough, we need to arm, spend more, spend more, spend more. So this is not the first time that Taiwan has played a role in the debate over increasing military spending. And I appreciate your contribution and Stimson's contribution to bring realism to a realistic analysis to this discussion. Having spent most of my career as a business executive for ComSat, IBM, and VeriSign, I've been to both China and Taiwan in business quite a few times. And my impression, I wanted to get your reaction to this, was that you don't have the elements of Serb versus Croatian, of ethnic differences between the two. They will fight to the death because it's one tribe conquering another tribe. You don't have the ideological confrontation of East Germany versus West Germany, or North Korea versus South Korea, of communism. You know, they're both basically capitalist countries. So that the impression I have, and I just interested in your reaction, is that most of the Taiwanese I spoke with said, "Hey, what I really care about is getting rich. If I can get rich by unifying Taiwan with China, great." And most Chinese, mainland Chinese, felt, what I really want is getting rich And if having Taiwan separate gets us richer, then fine. But I didn't see any ethnic conflict. I didn't see any ideological conflict. So I don't see, I'm not even sure that most Taiwanese wouldn't say, hey, listen, if they offered us $100,000 apiece, we'll take it. Fine, do it. So I'd be interested in your reaction to the really underlying assumption that the Taiwanese would fight to the death to not allow the Chinese to conquer Taiwan.
That's great points you've made. You may have set off some flares amongst different groups, amongst different Taiwanese groups, because I think it does differ in Taiwan on your political orientation per se. We see if you align with the DPP, you might be more inclined to see yourself as Taiwanese, which is separate from Chinese. The KMT tends to have a little bit more of a different background understanding of Chinese versus Taiwanese. So I think it is not a black and white issue. It is not Taiwanese and Chinese. It is a very complicated issue. And I mean, you have Taiwan, which is the Republic of China, which technically says it lays claim to all of mainland China. So, and I mean, we even visited museums in Taiwan that have ancient artifacts from the mainland. So you do have so much interconnection across the strait. And I do think that nobody wants war, generally. But it depends on the situation. Of course, if you have someone laying siege to your city and they're not going to differentiate between you and a fighter because whatever the circumstances are, I think it's much more complicated. But kind of tying back to what Ken was asking about, what would it look like if an invasion was actually successful? The PRC doesn't want to have an island of a bunch of dissidents that are constantly rejecting their rule over the island. And so, there's lots of different political and economic intricacies that the PRC would have to work out, and they've been trying to lay different policies in plan. We have the one country, two systems policy that didn't really work as well as they hoped in Hong Kong, and so they've realized that won't exactly apply in Taiwan, that Taiwan is very adamant about having its own political authority over its territory. So the PRC would have to somehow work out a very, delicate law that basically says you are our province, but you control yourself. That's a hard question for the PRC to try and answer.
I think we have time for one more question. And James, I think this is a good one from you from online audience member Nirmal Verma. The question: a number of analysts have recommended that the policy of strategic ambiguity should be changed to strategic reality. What is your view?
I think that strategic reality, the way that the question is framed, would acknowledge more explicitly, more openly, Taiwan's autonomy and de facto independence from the PRC. The PRC has never governed Taiwan, and people usually refer to the idea of strategic clarity rather than reality because it has to do with what the US policy is toward Taiwan and navigating cross-strait relations. In 1979, the United States established normal diplomatic relations with the PRC and severed diplomatic relations and nullified a defense treaty with the Republic of China. This was a switch in recognition, and it committed to thereafter having political recognition of the PRC as the one legal government of China, and that it did not contest China's view that there is only one China. The PRC has been very explicit this whole time that its single most important issue with the United States and with relations with the United States is the Taiwan issue, and that it would oppose any effort to separate Taiwan from China, or to create two Chinas, or to create one China and one Taiwan, or any other formulation, that the PRC would oppose any of those kinds of efforts. So, strategic reality is that we are in a frozen conflict, effectively. And recognition of the frozen nature of the conflict, that the Chinese Civil War remains unresolved in the eyes of the PRC, and that that is largely the United States doing because we interrupted the continuation of that Civil War. There's more history there than we have time for here. But I would argue that the alternative to strategic ambiguity and a policy of dual deterrence, whereby the United States focuses on deterring China from attacking Taiwan and deters Taiwan from taking steps that would knowingly bring about a war with China, is the policy of the United States, or has been the policy of the United States, for very good reason. Because the alternative is a unfreezing of a conflict in which the United States is standing on one